thank you for joining me on this mandated reporter training. Um, just to give you like some context on like why we even have this training, it's because as a swing sub, you do spend a considerable amount of time with children. So it's just really important to know the things to expect and things that you should see versus should not see. Um, in schools, typically nowadays, schools expect that every adult in the building is a mandated reporter. And actually, the state law is beginning to require proof that every adult in the school building is a mandated reporter. Um, Via Swing, we give you guys some affidavits. I'm not exactly sure what the documents are called on your dashboard to where you can check off to say that you understand what it means to be a mandated reporter. But I do want to make sure that this is here so you actually understand the full context of it. I think it's different from just checking off a box. But before we get started, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I'll introduce myself. My name is Chioma. I am the marketing manager for community and events at Swing. So essentially, my work is to make sure that all of our subs get the support that they need, they get the professional development tools that they need as well, and then they just feel heard. And prior to joining Swing, I was a principal, and well, I was a principal, and then before that, I was a teacher for several years. But yeah. And how long have you been with Swing so far?
I think I subbed for like 6 weeks.
6 weeks? All right,
Yeah,
awesome.
I have my preliminary teaching credential, single subject.
Oh, perfect. Excellent. Yeah, I actually still have my preliminary. Yeah, I have my preliminary multi-subject because I didn't necessarily get the chance to clear it from coming from New Jersey. But yeah, it's awesome. All right, we're gonna dive right on in. And if you have any like thoughts or questions about any of this, feel free just to chime in at any point. And I'm totally cool with that. So just the agenda, we're going to go take a look at the background of child abuse and neglect in this country, talk through some of the definitions of it, and then what the law requires of you as a mandated reporter. Hi, thank you so much for joining. Um, how to make a report of suspected child abuse and neglect, and special reporting procedures to report special circumstances. And so if you're just joining, feel free, if you have any questions or anything, feel free to like ask them or thoughts. So we'll dive right into the history and statistics. And so I started actually in 1962 because prior to 1962, it's really interesting. There were no laws on the books to protect children. So whenever there was a case where a child was being abused, they actually had to refer to animal law, laws designed to protect animals, and use that as justification as to why the child should be protected. But in 1962, Journal of American Medical Association stated that the symptoms of child abuse, that there are symptoms of child abuse and that it is medically diagnosable, which is really huge. So it kicked off these series of events in which child abuse, the first child abuse reporting law in California was enacted in 1963. And then 10 years, within the 10-year period, every state had statutes known as mandatory reporting laws thereafter. In 1980, now we do have a law on the books on a federal scale. So the Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act was passed in that year. And then there have been numerous amendments to expand the definition of child abuse and a list of people who are required to report it. So as someone who, as like our subs and you guys work with children, you do fall into a category in which you are required to report suspected child abuse or neglect. And then today, some of these statistics are pretty unfortunate, but they do kind of paint a story. The fact that there are more than 3.6 million reports of child abuse that involve almost 6 million children, and 4 or 5 children a day are killed by child abuse and neglect, which is why it's super important that we're aware of the signs so that we possibly have the chance to save a child's life. These are some other statistics. It just kind of illustrates the percentage of child victims by age. And so as you can see, the younger the child is, the more prevalence of child abuse, mostly because our youngest kids don't have the voice to say or express what's happening to them. Here's some more stats. The one that always stands out to me is the 74.8% of children who suffered some sort of neglect. Neglect, there is a pretty wide definition for neglect, and a lot of children do suffer from neglect, and the parents may not even be fully aware that that is exactly what is going on. We're going to go into that definition a little bit later on, but in general, these statistics are pretty eye-opening. And if you guys want to say anything, feel free to engage because I know this is kind of heavy stuff. And then also too, child abuse and neglect can occur any family, socioeconomic level, religion, educational level, basically everywhere. There's no key identifier for when or if it happens. So child welfare services, it's really interesting. A lot of people have this idea that child welfare services, their only goal is to take the child out of the home, and that's actually not true. We know now that in terms of development, it really does affect the child to be removed from a very familiar situation, even if it's not necessarily the best situation at the time. So their main goal is to keep the child in their home if it is a safe enough environment, and give the tools and give the parents the tools to adequately take care of the child rather than to pull the child out completely. Now, if it is a completely unsafe environment, then they are going to have to remove the child and find a way to still maintain some level of normalcy while trying to figure out the best optimal solution for the child. All right, mandated reporters. As a mandated reporter, I stress this enough, like you are basically a hero. In my role as a teacher and principal, I have made many reports, unfortunately, but at least knowing that I'm making these reports, I felt confident in the fact that I'm speaking up for a child that otherwise could not speak up for themselves. So it is a heroic act. It may not feel that way initially, but it truly is if you can impact a child's life. So mandated reporters are people who come in contact with children as part of their employment, practice of their profession, or volunteers. Swing employees do fall in this category, which is why a lot of our even school partners do assume that all of our subs are mandated reporters. And so as a mandated reporter, you're required to make a report of suspected abuse when you have a reasonable cause to suspect that a child is a victim of child abuse and neglect, the key phrase there is reasonable cause, or otherwise known as reasonable suspicion. So you don't have to know for a fact that something is going on. And the child does not have to tell you that there's something going on. And it's not your job to do investigations to see whether or not it's true or not. That there are people whose jobs and professions, and they're just trained for that. But at the same time, if you feel that there is something off, you feel that there's something that is going on with the child, then you should definitely report. So here are a list of circumstances in which you should make a report. A lot of these do apply to you as a swing sub. I think the only one that does not is the last bullet point. But basically, any work that you're doing with a child puts you in a position to be a mandated reporter and make a report. Okay. So in terms of the legal impact of mandated reporters, a lot of people don't report because they have there's literally a slew of reasons. There are personal concerns. They may think, oh my gosh, this kid's going to be removed. Oh, the parent may know that I reported them. All of these different things. They don't think that the system's going to do anything. There's no evidence. They're not sure. Regardless of all those things, we're thinking about the child, so we should report. It is important for you guys to know that there is always a risk of fines or imprisonment on mandated reporters who fail to report suspected child abuse and neglect. This does not happen very often. Quite frankly, something like that would happen in a case to where someone is with a child almost on a daily basis, and there's just undeniable evidence that abuse or neglect is happening and the person is just not taking notice of that at all. And then also too, there are penalties imposed on anyone that files a false report. If you do believe something is happening and you have that reasonable cause, there is no penalty at all. But if it is knowingly false, then there is. In terms of protections, your name is confidential. The report in and of itself is also confidential, except to child welfare services and law enforcement. If law enforcement wants additional information, then they can submit your name. The child welfare services can submit your name to law enforcement, but you're treated as a confidential informant. So no one else will know that it was you that made the report. And then you're also protected from civil and criminal liability if acting in good faith. So there are several types of child abuse and neglect. I try my best to compile, because there's all of this information is from a very, very large seminar, and I try my best to compile the most critical information for you guys to get the meat of each different type. All right, so we already mentioned the 3.6 million referrals and 6.6 million children. And so here are the different types of child abuse and neglect, and we're going to go through them one by one. So we have physical abuse, we have child sexual abuse, willful or unjustified punishment, which can fall under physical abuse, neglect, emotional abuse, and then what they call exploitation. All right, so with physical abuse. So any injury that comes from over discipline. So anything like striking, kicking, burning, biting, if you see marks on their skin or welts, um, choking, throwing, whipping, or anything that injures a child, something that just feels like it's completely out of the realm of something like a child falling off a chair or something like that, it's considered physical abuse. And then here are some locations in which we would typically see it. So we have the questionable fractures, cuts, scrapes, abrasions, burns, bruises, and welts. And once again, if you guys have anything to say or add or ask, still, please feel free to do so, because my voice is not the best. So here are some behavioral indicators of child abuse. So specifically looking at the child and some of the behaviors they exhibit. Yeah. Anything that stands out to you guys about this list? Anything interesting? And with, oh, go ahead. Were you going to say something?
I was just gonna say I was surprised that if they would hide it, the hiding part is kind of just kind of sad how
Yeah,
they react.
definitely. Definitely. I feel like students do that, kids do that for a variety of different reasons. Sometimes it is just out of shame. Sometimes they feel as though they deserved what happened to them. And so like covering it up is as part of that shame. Um, yeah, and then other times it's like they don't want other kids to see the marks and make fun of them. But in the grand context of things, they are just not aware that it's abuse. It's really, really interesting. So I do have some, let's make sure I did not skip. I do have some parental behavior indicators. A lot of times you guys won't be around the parents except if you're around for dismissal or maybe arrival or there's like some special cases. But it is just interesting just for your context, just to know some like some behavioral indicators of parents. Some of these are kind of hard to know, like off the moment, like rarely touches and displays physical affection towards a child. It's kind of hard to say like, oh, this is abuse, but obviously if the parents calling the child stupid, ridiculous, all those kind of words, then there's a sign that there's something more is happening there. And excessive anxiety about the child's behavior is also an interesting one too. So just reportable physical abuse. So these three fall underneath that category. So any willful harming or injuring of a child or endangering the person or health of a child, unlawful corporal punishment or injury, or non-accidental physical injury. All of those fall under physical abuse. Sometimes even I've even had cases to where kids would come to school and talk about how they were disciplined at home, and then I had to report that too. Like a kid would say, "Oh yeah, like my mom got out a shoe and started hitting me with it." That's not okay, and so also had to report that. Um, Also important to note what physical abuse is not. So kids fighting is not physical abuse. Any injury that's caused by a person employed in the public school to for self-defense purposes is not physical abuse. There are sometimes situations where like kids need to be restrained for their own safety. Not. And then the same thing with number three with the peace officer. We talked about willful harm in terms of the act being done on purpose. A lot of abuse, particularly like the burning and welts and things like that, is done on purpose, and that all is constituted as physical abuse. Some other things to think about whether or not it is willful: the age of the child, prior history of injuries, location of the injuries, multiplicity of the injuries, multiple welts, multiple marks, and the type of trauma inflicted. More than likely, you guys, unless you are in a longer term assignment or even a couple days, you won't necessarily see this, but good to know either way. And then mental suffering also falls underneath this category. Um, and you see the quotes here: "You'll never amount to anything. You're worthless. You're nothing but trouble. I wish you were never born. Why can't you be more like your brother?" Mental suffering is not required to be reported, but may be reported. I was just telling someone the other day, I was like, "Why can't you be more like your brother?" Or something I feel like my mom said to me. Once again, it really just depends on the context, and that's why it's not required to be reported. Um, and then this, like, kind of discuss whether what should be done if there is just no physical injury. As we know, abuse and neglect occur like exist outside of physical injuries. So like if a child is abandoned, exploited, a child being left without adult supervision for extended period of time, all of these do constitute as abuse because you are inflicting harm on a child's health or welfare. And just like a personal anecdote on this, in terms of leaving a child um, without supervision at the school, oftentimes, not oftentimes, there was one kid who school day was over at 3:30. The parents could not be contacted. Someone finally picked up the child at 7 o'clock in the evening. The school's not does not have food, does not have resources to provide the child, and then we have like employees, and then even in that case, we'd have to make a report because that is willful harm on the child. Okay, so yes, yeah. So I added some questions on here. So we can also quickly discuss these too. So the question is, when you observe an injury you suspect to be the result of physical abuse, which examples should you be concerned about? Any thoughts?
Okay.
Oh, what did you say? You said all of them?
Yeah.
Yeah, most definitely. It's definitely all of them. It kind of highlights the fact that abuse can happen regardless of age. And I'm sorry about this, but a 7-year-old child goes to school with linear red bruises on his cheeks. He was absent the day prior. When you ask him what happened to his cheek, he replies that he fell while riding his bike. Do you report this injury?
Awesome, yes, because injuries.
Yeah, you definitely report it because the linear marks resemble like a hand. And it could be a slap because I think we're all aware we fall on concrete. There's a scrape, and that scrape is it's very an unmistakable physical mark versus a slap mark. All right. The next one is sexual abuse. Um, Here are some interesting facts, particularly about sexual abuse. The last point always stands out the most to me as perhaps just the most disgusting, to be quite honest. That the average pedophile molests 260 victims during their lifetime. And it just highlights just, I guess, the magnitude of this issue and the fact that we are here to support these kids if anyone is going through something like this. So child sexual abuse is a form of abuse that includes sexual activity with a minor. The key thing here is a child cannot consent to any form of sexual activity, period. Like, there's no consent whatsoever. And then another important point to take out is that this unfortunately occurs about anywhere. So at home, neighborhood, schools, youth sports environments, online with exploitation, and child pornography, or just communicating by a sexual manner via the phone or the internet. Here's a list of some forms of sexual abuse. And sexual abuse is often broken up into two categories. It's sexual assault and sexual exploitation. Sexual assault is the sexual contact or behavior that occurs without the explicit consent of the recipient. And children, once again, cannot give any consent. And sexual exploitation is when someone uses their power to manipulate or deceive a child into sexual activity in exchange for something that the child wants. Right. So in this, I'm going to go through some child behaviors, and I'm also going to go through some behaviors of adults who engage in this as well, just to give you all a heads up on that. Um, so the child behaviors, there are physical signs, behavioral signs, and emotional signs, and we're going to quickly go through all of them because more than likely children cannot express what is happening to them. So it is important for us to be aware of the signs. So here are some physical warning signs of possible child sexual abuse. I have like a little anecdote with this. So the school that I was a principal of, one of the teachers noticed that this little girl, she always had to use the bathroom. And so kids usually have to use the restroom a lot. Their bladders are small, but it's not a situation to where a child's asking to go to the bathroom like 2 times within an hour, 3 times within an hour. That is pretty excessive. So what that teacher ended up doing, she reported it, as she should, and it turns out that not only that little girl, but that little girl's two sisters, they were being sexually abused by the mother's, I believe it was the mother's boyfriend. And so child services had to intervene, and temporarily remove the kids from the home. And then from there, once the boyfriend was out of sight, brought them back together, put in stipulations to where the boyfriend was not there. And then those girls are now in therapy and they're doing pretty well. But if it wasn't for that teacher that noticed those frequent patterns, who knows how long that would have gone on. Here are some behavioral warning signs of child sexual abuse. And if you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to say anything. The most interesting one that people called out in the past was the last bullet, the may repeatedly set fires. Um, Children do that because they have a very hard time expressing their thoughts and their feelings. I actually went to school for social work, and one of the things they taught us, that was always a red flag, and they use this analogy, but it's true. So if you see, what was it? Um, if you see, think of a person urinating on a burning animal. So all of those in and of themselves are signs of distress and signs of trauma, of animal abuse, setting things on fire, inappropriate use of like your body, are all behavioral warning signs of one thing or another. Here are some emotional warning signs. And then once again, signs an adult may be hurting child, and in your roles in the school, like once again, this is not something that you really would see or just be aware of. Um, as someone like myself who I don't have children yet, hoping to have children soon, I personally would like to know these signs. So this is why I included them in here. Because of this statistic here that 93% of the adults that are engaging in child sexual abuse are known to the victim. It's just always important to um, know the signs of those kind of adults. So they and the authorities have always interviewed people, these pedophiles who engage in this kind of behavior. And these are the 2 points that they pulled out of in terms of the children that they choose to abuse. So they either look for a passive, quiet, troubled, or lonely child from single parent or broken home, or they seek out children who are particularly trusting and work proactively to establish a trusting relationship. before abusing them, which extends to a trusting a relationship with the victim's family as well. Oftentimes, adults who don't necessarily have traditional relationships, friendships, and the like with other adults. Here are some additional signs that an adult may be hurting a child. And so, like, the does not seem to have age appropriate relationships comes up again, secretive and isolated, controlling with family members. The first point about not respecting boundaries or listening when someone tells them no is a pretty big red flag. And also the other one that sticks out is unduly protective of the child and severely limits the child's contact with other children, especially of the opposite sex. Okay. I have a few questions to go over. So you're working in a daycare. You repeatedly observe a 4-year-old boy humping and kissing a teddy bear in a sexual way. When you ask him why he's doing that, he does not reply. He has never disclosed sexual abuse. Which of the following are you required to do as a mandated reporter?
Report to the local authorities as this is not normal.
Definitely. Definitely. It's not normal behavior at all for a child to be doing that, and a child is really too young to express what is happening as well. And then also too, I want to call out this answer choice here discussed with his parents. I think that that is often a natural inclination for a lot of people. They're like, oh, this child is doing something weird. Let me talk to your parents about it. Um, the reason why that is not suggested is because we never know if it's a parent that this is happening with. So to best protect a child, it is best to report it. We never interview children about abuse because we're just not equipped for that. All right, next question. A 13-year-old girl tells you that she is having sex with her 17-year-old boyfriend. She denies the use of force, stating that she wants to have sex with him because she loves him. As a mandated reporter, you should.
Definitely report
Yes.
the child raper.
Go ahead.
The last one.
Yes,
Report to a child raper.
definitely. And it's because of the age difference. She's under 14, he is over 14. Once again, typical thing to notify the parents. However, we don't know how that's going to go, so definitely report it to the child welfare agency. The next section is neglect. So neglect is it's a pretty large category, which is why it's important for us to know some of the signs of neglect. Most parents don't hurt or neglect their children intentionally, but neglect usually encompasses the failure to provide for care of the child's basic needs. All right, so there are two categories. We have general neglect, so not providing adequate food, clothing, shelter, medical care, or supervision. And then there's no physical injury associated with that. And then severe neglect is failing to protect the child from severe malnutrition or medically diagnosed non-organic failure to thrive. Um, and so the parent is basically acting in a way that it is most definitely going to harm the child. Failing to take the child to the hospital when the child really needs to go also constitutes as neglect. And then also with the malnutrition aspect, was remind myself to mention this. Sometimes it is asked whether or not, let's say we are talking about a 10-year-old child and the child weighs 200 pounds, whether or not that falls in this category. The child weighs 200 pounds, the child has trouble walking and is wheezing and blood sugar spikes and all those kind of things. It does fall underneath the category of neglect. You can definitely use your best judgment in terms of reporting. However, if the child, the child's symptoms is preventing him from just being a regular child and enjoying life, then I would definitely report that as well. That's a very rare case, though. So there is physical neglect. So here are some examples of that. I will say definitely in a school sense, I've seen a lot more cases of physical neglect, particularly in sometimes more lower income areas. However, once again, the parents not attending to, like, so for instance, the failure to provide clothes that are appropriate for the weather. If it's too cold, the child doesn't have like a thick enough jacket. More than likely, the parent not intentionally sending the child to school without warm clothes. Just they may not have the means as well. So context is also super important. We also have emotional neglect, which is pretty huge, because as children, they require attention and affection. They need to feel love and they need to feel supported. So keeping children as isolated from friends and loved ones, um, exposing them to drugs and alcohol and criminal activity, denying them of just those essential needs, that all falls under emotional neglect. We also have medical neglect. So keeping a child from getting the needed treatment, failing to follow medical recommendations for a child, basic preventative care for children, all falls underneath this category. And then the last one is educational neglect. Also another one that we see a lot in the school system. So um, school attendance is compulsory, which means that students, they have to go to school. It is just a blueprint to even have success in the future. You have to take your children to school. So if a child misses a lot of school, child's not enrolled in school without any home-based education, or the child is not getting special education classes when they need it, this all falls under educational neglect. Um, Big question always is, does poverty equate to neglect? Um, Sometimes, because usually when people are living in situations of poverty, they're living in it's very stressful environment. And so when you're thinking about the types of neglect combined with a lot of these other risk factors, there is a higher prevalence of neglect there, but just because someone is poor does not mean that they are being neglectful. So we're going to go through some red flags in terms of neglect for children. And so it's really interesting, like the way that the last two lines are phrased. While physical abuse is usually episodic, child physical neglect tends to be chronic. And once again, there are the physical and behavioral indicators of physical neglect. So here are the physical indicators. And if anything stands out to you or anything, just please feel free to state it. All right. We have some additional physical indicators. We also have the behavioral indicators. Sometimes it's interesting. Kids will sometimes just tell you what it is. The stating that there is no caretaker is a pretty significant one that is in and of itself a cry for help from kids. And then here's some parental factors. Once again, you may not necessarily like see the parents, but um, it is it is good to know. And for the sake of time, I'm going to like move a little quickly through the rest of it just to make sure that I'm being super um, respectful of your time. This one is pretty good though. Says you're a paramedic and are dispatched to a house for a woman who's having trouble breathing. When you arrive, you notice a very dirty house with trash, cigarette butts, and dead insects on the floor. While there, you see a toddler who's pale, very thin, and wearing dirty clothes. What type of neglect is this, and what should you do?
I think it should be general neglect, and you should
Hmm.
report to child welfare.
Definitely, definitely. Um, General neglect, their livelihood. Obviously, the child's pale and very thin, um, and living in that environment. So it falls into that umbrella of general neglect. Excellent. Um, and this this is kind of self-explanatory, so I'm going to skip that for time. So we also have emotional abuse. Emotional abuse is just as impactful as physical abuse or neglect. So there are different types of emotional abuse. So rejecting and ignoring the child, shaming, humiliating the child, terrorizing the child, isolating the child, and corrupting the child. Corrupting means means pushing children to do criminal behavior like stealing, shoplifting, those kind of things. Right. And we're here. So red flags in terms of children's behavior who may be encountering some sort of emotional abuse. So sleeping disorders, speech disorders, the soiling, running away, suicidal threats or thoughts, phobias, health problems like ulcers and skin disorders, which usually indicates a lot of stress, age inappropriate behavior, impaired memory, mental confusion, significant sadness, inability to form those trusting relationships. And then this is an isolated case to where you're able to observe necessarily family, but here's just an example of red flags if it is abuse or poor parenting. Of course, is the withholding affection, calling the child cruel, preferential treatment to some siblings, untreated mental illness, cold towards a child, rejects a child, blames a child, poor anger management. All right. So you work with a 9-year-old child who has frequent behavior problems, and you notice the child is not eating lunch. When you ask why, he tells you he got in trouble and is not allowed to eat. He also tells you the last time he ate was 2 days ago, and that he sits at the table while the rest of the family eats. What do you do?
This is the last one. This is the
Yeah.
cruel and bizarre punishment and should be reported.
Yes, definitely. As there is a child in the screen. Hi. Yeah, see, it should definitely be reported. A lot of times it's really sad to say that a lot of times situations like that are not necessarily reported, because people feel like, oh, this child usually has behavioral problems anyway. They're not telling the truth, which is really sad to see, but that is very, very concerning. For time, I'm going to actually skip this question and go on to making a report. So with making a report, as I mandated to report it, you cooperate with an investigation, notify the police, and testify if necessary. Most of the time, the last 2 bullet points do not happen. One also important thing to note, while you're in school, and if you see something that looks like abuse and neglect, you're not going to be filling out this report by yourself. So don't feel like, oh my gosh, I don't know all these things about this child. It is best to pair up with a teacher on that grade level or school admin that has access to specific information about the child, and you'll see in a little bit as we look at the form. Why that information is important. So I'm skipping through this for a reason, but basically, it's not an accusation. It's just, making a report as a preventative, just a precautionary measure. And then, so some places you could just make the report via the telephone. One thing that I have done is I just saved the phone number in my phone, just so that I have it. They'll also ask you to fill out a written report, and this is a report that you should fill out with either a school admin or another teacher. And that should be sent within 36 hours of reporting the event. That form is Form SS8572, and it can also be found online. But I have like snapshots of the form so that you guys can see. But in general, this is all the information that they're going to ask you for, and which is why you want to partner up with someone that has a little bit more context, because obviously you may be aware of the child's name, probably know the child's age, and the injuries as well, but you won't know the child's address and those other details. So it's just interesting just to partner. It's just best to partner up with someone. This is how the form looks like. So the top part, you will fill out with your information. Here, you are going to just fill this out with school administrator or a fellow teacher. And then this bottom section is about the child. So fill out that key information about the child, which you may not be fully aware of. So always ask. And then down here is where you would write in exactly what the incident was. All right, I'm going to skip that. We've already seen a copy of the form and the website. So one thing I do want to emphasize is that when a child discloses that their abuse to you, it means that they trust you, and that's a really, really, really big deal. So it's important to act in a way that's reassuring to the child. So you don't engage in conversations with the child about like, what is this abuse, or what, like, you don't ask them further questions, but still just try to be like reassuring, still try to go on the day as the day is going. But it does show a lot of trust. And so with that trust, we do report to make sure that children are safe. So here are just some of those steps that I talked about, kind of codified in one little slide. If the report, so basically you file the report, you fax it in, usually with the help of school admin or a fellow like teacher on the grade level, and then they will contact you, and then the child welfare agency has 3 to 10 days to respond to the report. And so within that time, they'll have one of the social workers check it out. They may reach out to you for additional context, and then they'll determine whether or not it is substantiated or not. And if it's substantiated, then they'll go through the proceedings, probably legal, police, and all those kind of things. And if it is not, then at that point they'll just leave it alone. It'll still be kept on their files as well. And so for time, I'm going to skip this, but you let the child protection investigators and law enforcement interview the child. You should never be in a position to interview the child because it may be very, very difficult for the child to talk about it again if that interviewing is done incorrectly. And then this question, who reports when there are 2 or more mandated reporters who suspect or have knowledge of the same child being abused or neglected? The correct answer here is that a single report may be made. I'm so sorry. A single report may be made. Yes, I'm so sorry. You never pass it off to anyone else. You don't ask the supervisor to make the report. A single report can be made. 2 people can make the same report, but I think it's just in terms of just the time to process it, having one person write the report is the best. Okay. And then special circumstances, you guys won't necessarily see too much. This more so revolves in terms of like special circumstances that students are in. So domestic violence situations, parental substance abuse, and drug exposed in infants. And so if they are in a home that does encounter a lot of domestic abuse, you should make a report if it is known. So if the child is expressing these things, you should make a report. More than likely you won't see anything like that. But yeah, just for your general knowledge. And I'm going to end there.